Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Miriam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. The horse racing industry has many tales of magnificent racehorses in its history. However, one of the most remarkable stories about this history is finally being told by our guest today, Kim Wickens, author of Lexington, The Extraordinary Life and Turbulent Times of America's Legendary Racehorse. She joins us today to share how this 19th century thoroughbred captured the hearts and minds of avid spectators and how his legendary races would impact the sport. Kim Wickens grew up in Dallas, Texas, and practiced as a criminal defense attorney in New Mexico for 20 years. Her love of horse racing and dressage led her to the story of Lexington and to writing it for the world to read. She is now living in Kentucky, where she trains in dressage with her 3 horses. We are very happy to have her with us on the podcast today. Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Good. I'm glad you're here. Before we get started on the podcast, I wanted to give you an opportunity to give our listeners a little bit of a background about your life and how you came to Lexington, because I know that you're not originally from here, right?
Right. So it's a very unusual path, and also a very unusual path into how I came to write the book. But by background, I'm a criminal defense attorney, still licensed as a criminal defense attorney in New Mexico, so not licensed in Kentucky, but in New Mexico, and that's where I lived for many years. I was born in Texas in the Dallas area, and then eventually moved to New Mexico, where I started practicing law for 20 years. So I was a practicing attorney for 20 years. But I have always in my life had a fascination with horses and racehorses in particular. I had the little Breyer figures as a child in my Barbie ruffian and secretariat, and so I grew up with the idea of racehorses and the love of racehorses, in my life, and was just by chance, reading a book about Man o' War, the racehorse Man o' War, who I love. I love Man o' War. I think besides Lexington, Man o' War is probably my most favorite racehorse. And in the book that I was reading, the authors compared Man o' War to Lexington, and they said that Man o' War was to the 20th century what Lexington was to the 19th century, in that both horses were able to lift basically the communities, the people of the times, that they lived, and they were able to lift them up into another realm almost, that these people were aware that when they had seen these horses, they had seen something they would never, ever forget. And so I became entranced with this whole idea of Lexington because I had never heard of him at that point, and that pretty much started it right there.
Yeah, so it all started with reading.
Yes.
So you learned about this horse, Lexington, and then what made you kind of veer away from your criminal defense background?
Well, so when I started researching Lexington, because it became, so naturally I wanted to know more about this horse, Lexington, because I was not aware of him. And it started with a Wikipedia search, which was about half a page. There was nothing, right? There were some articles that had been written about him in the late 1970, 1980, and I was able to get those in interlibrary loans and through the Albuquerque Public Library. And it became apparent to me pretty quickly that there was not a book about Lexington. So there was not a comprehensive story about him. And so I just started researching the horse. And the more I researched him and the times that he lived in and the people that were involved in his life, the more interesting it became to me. He really did have a huge impact on the Civil War antebellum period at that time. And so then naturally, if you're going to write about a racehorse, you have to go to Keeneland Library,
of course,
Lexington. And so
of course,
that thus started my journeys, over here to
So
Lexington.
Tell us about what you found. What about his early years, where he was born, and how he became such a leading figure in the horse racing industry.
Lexington was foaled here in Lexington, Kentucky, under the name Darley. He was originally named after the Darley Arabian by his breeder, Dr. Elisha Warfield, who was the leading obstetrician here, in Lexington, Kentucky, had birthed Mary Todd Lincoln. I mean, pretty famous connection there. And so Dr. Warfield had bred this colt from his very cantankerous and very agitated mare named Alice Carnell, and he had bred Alice Carnell to a very famous racehorse named Boston. And the horse Boston was not named for Boston, Massachusetts, but was named for a card game in which he was ante-upped as collateral.
Wow.
Basically the winning, hand, and he was lost in a card game of Boston. And so he became named Boston. But the byproduct there was the horse Darley. And Dr. Warfield was very elderly at the time and was no longer, training racehorses. And it was at that time that he then associated with a gentleman by the name of Harry Lewis, who was a former enslaved man that had then gained his freedom. And Harry Lewis had worked with some of the most renowned racehorses in Kentucky, prior to Darley. And so Harry Lewis took over basically the training of Darley. Dr. Warfield still owned Darley, but Harry Lewis leased the training rights from Dr. Warfield, trained him, and then entered him in his first 2 races. And so it was Harry Lewis who started the horse Darley that then becomes Lexington.
How did he become to the attention of his owner?
Ultimately, Lexington.
Lexington, yeah.
He was racing at the old Association Racecourse here in Lexington with Harry Lewis. And there was this man from New Orleans named Richard Tenbrook. And Richard Tenbrook was originally out of Albany, New York, but had kind of meandered his way, down south into the deep south in New Orleans. And at that time, New Orleans was the horse racing mecca in the nation. That was the
and we're
place
talking
to
like
be.
Mid-19th century,
Yeah,
early
so
19th
at this point, we're talking 1853, 1852, 1853. And he owned the Metairie Racecourse in New Orleans, which is now a cemetery, oddly. But he owned the Metairie Racecourse, and he was a great promoter. I mean, this guy, he could stage these fantastic events and knew exactly what to do to draw attention and publicity to these events. And so he had come up with this race, which he had titled the Great State Post Stakes, and it was supposed to be a race where various states came to the Metairie Racecourse in New Orleans to compete for the title of best horse for whatever state. And so he could not get the state of Kentucky to commit to participate in this race. And so he travels to Lexington, Kentucky, not only to put together a team from the Kentucky area, but also to find a horse to represent the state of Kentucky. And it's at the Association Racecourse that he sees Darley in his very first race, and he just blows away the competition. And Tenbrook knows at this point this is the horse he needs to buy. And so he eventually does. And being the promotional sales wizard that he can't have a horse named Darley running for the state of Kentucky. And so he changes the name to Lexington.
That's a very fascinating story about the beginnings of Lexington. So in your book, there's a couple of races that kind of grabbed my attention is, of course, the infamous race that kind of put Lexington on the map of racehorsing. So tell us a little bit about that story and the little controversy that happened afterwards.
So Lexington goes to New Orleans, and he does a fantastic job, wins the post stakes, then is immediately matched against a horse that he almost lost to but didn't, by the name of Lecomte. And Lecomte was a horse out of Louisiana. Yeah. And he's matched within 7 days against this horse Lecomte. And it was one of those circumstances where Lecomte, was running well. Lecomte was kept in training right after that race, whereas Lexington had, kind of been taken out of the stable. This is all in just 7 days. Had been taken out of the stable. His shoes were removed. He was basically taken out of training and then pulled quickly back into training. Okay. When they realized that they were going to run him again in this race against Lecomte. And Lecomte ends up not only defeating Lexington in that race, but he breaks an American speed record for running 4 miles, because back then horses were not running furlongs, they were running these outrageous distances of what
That's
we
what I
think of
found also
today.
fascinating. Yeah, it's not like the same
No, it's not
short
the same race that we have today.
It was pretty intense.
It was very
for
intense. Of
yeah.
course, they were trained and bred differently back then, but back then these horses ran heat races. And so the upper echelon of racing back then were these 4-mile heats. And so a horse could compete. They would run 4 miles and then take a 45-minute cool down period to recuperate, and then they would go back out and contest another 4 miles. And this could go on 12 miles, even more than that, until you had at least one horse win 2 heats.
Wow.
The same horse had to win at least 2 heats. And so usually you would have the same horse winning 2 heats and the race would be over at 8 miles. But still, can you imagine even
That's
4
a lot.
miles?
That's
And so he was running these fantastic races. And so Lecomte defeated Lexington and broke the American speed record for 4 miles in this race. And at this point, Lexington was taken to New York, where Tin Brook had planned to race him in New York and then take him over to England to race him in England. But he was so agitated, Tin Brook was, because he knew he should not have lost that race. And so he then challenges the owner of Lecomte to a match, with Lexington.
Wow.
But the owner refuses. There's all this back and forth. No, I'm not going to race on your terms. I'll only race if he comes to New Orleans, or, various things that made it impossible for the two to get together. And so Tin Brook does the next best thing, which was to challenge Lexington against the time of Lecomte that Lecomte had set when he broke the 4-mile record. And so he says, fine, to the owner of Lecomte, if you're not going to race me, then I'll race the time set by your horse. And that was really an astounding thing, because that had never been done in the history of American racing, to challenge a horse against a constant. They were always matched against other horses, but never against time itself. And so he is challenged against time, and there were quite a few obstacles that he had to overcome, but he eventually races time and wins in a dramatic way, so much so that not only did he lower Lecomte's time that he had set, but he lowered the world record for 4 miles, that had been set in England. And I mean, and it goes on after that, where he then has his final match against.
That's amazing. You talked about a little bit how racing was different back then. What did that do to sort of the health of the horses, for example? Like, were they able to run races like multiple races in a row, or how did they manage the health of the horses, especially because they were so expensive and it's
and that was interesting to me in terms of how were these horses trained, and how do you train a horse to run 4 miles? And so there was information that I found in the American Turf Register, primarily dating back to the 1830s, that talked in a very detailed way about how these horses were trained and fed and how they were worked, for this type of racing. And yes, they were coddled, to a large extent, but in some ways, no, because I mean, the racing, to prepare them for this type of racing, and they had very different methods, from what we would see today. They would clothe these horses. These horses were fully blanketed in flannel because they believed back then that when you worked a horse, you should sweat the horse in order to promote circulation and get the horse more. I mean, it sounds bizarre, to our thinking, but they would sweat the horse basically to improve circulation in their minds. And so these horses would work fully clothed, wrapped in flannel, in their exercise.
I'm wondering if it also kept the muscular structure more limber
and so forth. But they would walk these horses. So these horses would work 3 times a day. And they would walk for about an hour, just walking. They would walk the horses for about an hour, and then, eventually they work up to, a gallop, but not very much, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then they would walk. And so most of the routines were done at the walk. And then it wasn't until the horse was much more advanced in the training that they would then add in the other gaits, the trotting, the cantering, and then the gallop. But they would never gallop these horses for 4 miles. If you were preparing for a 4-mile race, the horse would never gallop, for 4 miles, just short distances, working gradually up to that. And in terms of bringing the horse back, recovering the horse, it was, again, very methodical in the barn where the horse was watched, around the clock, essentially. And they would rub the legs and they would wrap towels around the legs and they would only feed the horse very small amounts, and not even for the first 12 hours would they feed the horse, and then they would serve the horse wine with water, and in very small increment, very small amounts, because they didn't want the horse to become too full. And so they would work the horse in such a methodical way afterwards that it was said in these reports that I read that if the horse were worked in this way with all of this diligent care, that a horse could be race ready within 7 days to go another 4-mile race.
Wow.
It was amazing.
Wow. It's very similar to how athletes, football, soccer, basketball players are trained and fed, and nutrition is, so that's what that's amazing. So Lexington, how long was his racing career?
His racing career was not very long. So he only raced 7 races. And he raced primarily from 1853 to 1855 when he was retired. And he was retired because throughout the majority of his races, he ran partially blind and was losing his vision. So his right eye had lost vision, and then he was losing his vision in the left eye. And it became apparent that he needed to be retired. And what we think he now had was equine recurrent uveitis. And so when I talked to some of the physicians here in Lexington, equine ophthalmologist, we have such a thing.
Yes.
And told them basically the condition of what he had and what they thought caused it. It very much could have been a situation of equine recurrent uveitis that was brought on in Lexington's case by overeating and then being exercised the next morning, basically causing an infection, more or less, that entered the bloodstream that then impacted the eye, and then leading to the equine recurrent uveitis, where the eyesight gradually, goes through these bouts of inflammation over time to the point that the horse eventually loses vision. But when he had that first episode after the binging and the exercising, he did lose the vision in the right eye. And then it was over time that he would suffer, with continual bouts of inflammation in the left eye.
Oh, okay. So where was he retired?
He was retired in New Orleans.
Oh.
And at that point, Richard Timbrook sends him to Versailles, Kentucky, where he's going to stand as stud at Bosque Bonita Farm under a friend of his. And it was much later when Timbrook went to England that he then encounters a man who approaches him about buying Lexington from him.
So he buys him?
He buys him. So he's at the Goodwood races in England, and he encounters a man by the name of Robert Aitchison Alexander, who is from Midway, Kentucky.
But they met in England.
They met in England.
Wow.
And Robert Alexander was there looking for stallions because he had this dream of turning this farm of his, Woodburn Farm, into a breeding operation for thoroughbreds. And he was already breeding cattle and sheep at that point, but he really endeavored to breed the thoroughbred. And yes, the thoroughbred was being bred in America at that time, but never on a systematic, planned out, thoughtful process.
Like a methodical way.
Yes, that Alexander had envisioned. And Alexander had spent many years growing up in England and Great Britain and had seen the way that the English bred horses, which was very methodical and very planned out, matching them to certain mares and keeping record of this, in a stud book. And that it did not exist, in America, that type of a methodical system that was recorded. We had no American stud book back then at this point. And Alexander endeavored to really bring credibility to the American thoroughbred. And to do that, he wanted to have pedigrees that were recorded. And if anyone had a desire to breed their mare to any of his stallions, they had to have a certified pedigree, more or less, that they would provide to him, that he would then decide if this was going to be a good match, for his stallions. But he himself was also breeding certain mares that he had acquired to his stallions. And in the case, in certain cases, it was what we call nick breeding now, where he would think, okay, I think this type of a mare who was sired by this excellent stallion would be a great cross with this stallion that I have over here. It would bring out stamina, or it would bring out speed. And so he very early on was having these thoughts about what would be the best match for this particular stallion. And so he was already collecting these brood mares that were sired by this champion racehorse Glencoe, from England, who was a very fast horse and had stamina. And when he approaches Richard Timbrook at the Goodwood, he says, this horse Lexington, do you think you might be willing to sell him? And so Richard Timbrook, of course, says, being the great salesman that he is like, aha, I have a very good potential here, And so he says to him, well, I don't know. I don't think I ever really have thought about selling Lexington, although he would be a fantastic stallion. I know he would. And I will sell him to you for $15,000, which in the horse world today,
that's like
is
millions.
Nothing, right? But back then, $15,000 was the most anyone had ever paid for a thoroughbred stallion. And Alexander said no at first because this was an unproven stallion. It was a horse that was known to have eye issues, and so he wasn't too sure about it, and he said no. But his friend, Alexander's friend, who was with him, said, you cannot leave the best horse in the world behind. You have to buy this horse. And so he then contacted Richard Timbrook and arranged to buy Lexington, and did. And so then Lexington becomes his cornerstone stallion at Woodburn Farm.
During this time, of course, the Civil War is breaking out. And so there was a lot of instability around the horse racing industry in general, but specifically for Lexington. He went through a lot towards the end of his years, the times where he was out to stud. So talk to us a little bit about how the political landscape shaped his life and how it impacted the horse racing industry in general.
So at that time, Alexander buys Lexington in 1856, which is right on the cusp of the Civil War. And so he stands in successfully at stud at Woodburn Farm for a number of years. But then at this point, the Civil War, breaks out, and Kentucky, being a border state, is divided. It's north and south. You have people that are torn in both directions in the state, which that with the desperation, that is brought on by the Civil War really takes what was a good society and brings it into a lawless and broken society. And it becomes fodder, basically, the state of Kentucky, for different factions, guerrilla factions that were then running rampant all over the state and usurping, the state basically and stealing, from the citizens of various towns, taking them out into the main square, just riding into town in broad daylight, taking the citizens out from banks or stores, wherever they were, lining them up in the town at gunpoint and demanding their items, their valuables.
They're taking advantage of instability
of the instability for their own benefit. And it was also the case that these guerrillas, and not just the guerrillas that were running, their own program, but also soldiers were always in need of horses, to replenish their horses. The average life expectancy of a Civil War horse was 6 months. And if it was a cavalry horse, it was 4 months. And so there was a constant need for horses, and a constant need especially for the thoroughbred horse, which is known to be a courageous and a fast and stamina, built horse. And Woodburn Farm, being at that time already recognized as a great breeder of the thoroughbred, became a farm eventually that the guerrilla factions and the Confederate soldiers had raided, for these horses to replenish their own, or in some cases to hold for ransom, because they were so valuable. It didn't start out that way, of course. Alexander had taken measures to try to protect Woodburn Farm. Since he technically was a British subject, he had flown the Union Jack because it was believed at the time that the Confederacy were aligned with England, which was false. But it was the hopes of the Confederacy that England would eventually come in to rescue the Confederacy. And, of course, that never happened. But this was common knowledge back then. And so Alexander would fly the Union Jack kind of like to ward off, raids. But that did not work. So
it didn't deter anybody.
That did not work. So Woodburn was eventually raided 3 times for its horses.
Wow. So Lexington would, of course, be out to stud. Tell us a little bit about his legacy, his offspring. What would come of their horse racing, or if they ever raced?
So Lexington, and this is during the Civil War when, as we talked, the horse racing was already declining, especially in the South, but it was picking up in the North. So Saratoga Racecourse comes on in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. And so horsemen were taking their horses out of, the South area and racing them up north. They had these very expensive animals. They still wanted to race despite everything that was going on around them. And they would travel these horses and race them, up in New Jersey and New York and so forth. So Lexington ultimately was recognized as the America's leading sire 16 times, which is unprecedented, to this date. And that was based on the fact that his get during any given year won, the most races. And so by virtue of that, having the most winning number of children, per year, he would be awarded that title. And this occurs during the Civil War, even as foals that he has are being taken for war purposes, either being stolen from farms or, just going into, war services in whatever manner. It's interesting that Lexington is also the sire of Cincinnati, the famous war horse owned by General Grant, and that was another interesting story of how he acquired, Cincinnati. And basically General Grant was in Vicksburg, and a gentleman had asked to visit with Grant, and Grant agreed to talk to him because the gentleman's name was S.S. Grant. And he thought, well, this is a very interesting situation. And so when he goes to visit this S.S. Grant, he finds out that S.S. Grant is dying, but that S.S. Grant truly admires General Grant and wants to give him the only valuable thing he owns, which is a true son of the magnificent Lexington. And Grant takes the horse and names him Cincinnati, and that becomes his most favorite war mount during the war. But other of Lexington's children who were not in the war obviously go on to racing careers. And, it's speculated that at the end of the war, that these races that are taking place in New York, at Saratoga and at the Jerome Park in New York, where these great showcases were happening with Lexington's son, Kentucky, and with Norfolk, another Lexington son, and with Asteroid, another star son of Lexington, that these 3 horses and their ability to draw in the nation post-war was one of the things that really drew the nation in some ways back together, was this recommuning with the sport that they loved as a nation and providing happier times after such a traumatic 4 years that the nation had been through.
That's very fascinating to me because of just the way that most sports, but I feel like horse racing probably contributed to that post-war, is this one thing that everybody can unite on. And you see that all over the world anytime there's conflict, especially with soccer. It seems to unite a nation that's in some sort of conflict. So horse racing today is, if we can move on to this subject, is, I guess, kind of mired with some controversy. Where do you see horse racing moving? It's very different. The landscape looks very different than it did, in Lexington's time or even Man o' War's time. Where do you see it heading with all the controversies that are surrounding the sport and the questions as to what are the best practices in the industry?
And I'll answer this question, but let me just say that I'm not an insider. I'm not an insider in the horse racing world. I'm a horse racing fan.
Yes.
And I love
You do dressage and all that, yeah, but not necessarily in the horse racing industry.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm not someone that talks to the breeders and the trainers and the jockeys and the owners. But I, as a race horse, fan and a lover of the sport for many years, I mean, it's a tragedy what you see now. And I think is it repairable? I certainly hope so. I mean, I think efforts are being taken, with HISA, the act that's in Congress where you have the congressional body that's trying to basically unify horse racing standards, across the board. Because right now it's someone can be disqualified in state A, but then they can go race next week over in state B, And so I think what they're trying to do is have some standard, across the board that applies everywhere. So that if a horse is disqualified over in state A, it's also disqualified in state B or the trainer. Of course, I mean, there's 1,000 things that we can look at and say what are causing these problems now. Is it the breeding, the large number of horses that are being bred, by one stallion, every year? Is it the track surfaces? Should we be racing on synthetic surfaces instead of dirt? That's an issue. Is it that they should not be racing at the age of 2? Which I personally don't think they should. I think they should be racing much later when they're 3 or older. Is it the drug, issue? Is it drug use? Are things not being done properly to manage that? And I think that's one of the things that HISA is trying to wrap its hands around too, is to try to come up with some kind of better way to catch the bad actors in the sport before it becomes a problem. And I think that statistics do show that overall things are improving, but you're always, I think, going to have different factions, people that want dirt, people that want synthetic turf. The handicappers think it's difficult to handicap a synthetic turf, but ultimately a synthetic turf might be better for a horse to run on. And so I think you have so many different groups of individuals within the sport, and bringing all those groups together somehow for the betterment of the horse, which ultimately is what it's about, the betterment of the horse and the betterment of the riders. I mean, these exercise riders and the jockeys that are getting on these horses and risking their lives on these horses. I think definitely things need to improve. I mean, it would be senseless to deny that. And I certainly hope that it can improve, because I mean it's a grand sport, when it's done right.
Yeah, definitely. But it's mind-boggling to me that all these years and there's no unifying organization that can determine the rules that are standard. Hopefully everything improves soon. So are you working on anything else after this, or how are you just kind of taking a break?
No, I'm behind. I'm behind. I feel so behind. I am working on something else.
Nice. Okay.
Not a horse story.
Okay.
But still nonfiction.
Okay.
And still in history, in the World War I time frame. And that's all I'll say about it. But
okay.
I'm starting to do research. I've been starting that. I feel like I should have started that earlier than I have. I feel kind of behind knowing how long it takes to get a project out. But I am actively working.
Well, we'll look forward to it. Thank you so much, Kim, for joining us today on the podcast. You've been listening to Kim Wickens, author of Lexington, Extraordinary Life and Turbulent Times of America's Legendary Racehorse. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Miriam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.